Hello, welcome to the Black Sheep Live. I am your host, Salome Siboney, writer, speaker, and co-founder of the Black Sheep, with my co-founder of the Black Sheep. Introduce yourself.
Jay Klein.
That's it? Nothing fancy?
That's me. I'm Jay Klein.
That's Jay Klein. And we are talking about potentially one of the hottest free speech cases going on right now, which is that of Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia student who was detained and is going to be potentially deported because of supposedly supporting terrorism, but there has been no evidence provided of that. So we're going to go through everything that has to do with this case and try to break it down to figure out what is actually happening here, because to me, it's giving Red Scare vibes, and it's not a good look for a lot of the supposed free speech warriors who have suddenly started abiding by a very esoteric, rare, and often not invoked immigration clause that they say trumps free speech. And so to help us do that, we have a guest, a civil liberties lawyer, Jenin Younes, who is going to help us figure out what the hell is going on. So settle in, get ready for the Black Sheep's deep dive into the Mahmoud Khalil case. And I will pass it over to you if you want to say a little bit about why this case is important and what our interest in this is, because, I mean, in reality, I think a lot of people want to make it about anything except free speech because it's beneficial to be able to simply say, this guy has no rights as a green card holder, and we can just deport people who we disagree with if we call them terrorists. But the reality is that, like we have said so often to the left, when you need free speech most is when you're going to wish you had defended it for others. And this very much seems like a case where that famous parable of, what is it, like, first they came for the socialists and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. It's like, yeah, you may not be a supporter of Palestinian rights or care about this issue at all. You may be on the opposite of that. But there are many people who are on the opposite of this position and still have recognized that this is a major threat to free speech. So I'll pass it over to you to get into the updates on this case, what we know so far, and then we will talk to our guest, civil liberties lawyer Jenin, who's going to break down the details for us.
So let's set the scene of where we are in Khalil's case. I don't think there's many people in America who don't know the basic gist of what's going on, which is there is a 30-year-old Syrian-born Palestinian refugee who was in America, a grad student at Columbia University, here first with a student visa and then on a green card. He has a wife and a child on the way. He has been arrested by ICE and is currently in a detention facility in Louisiana, taken from New York City to Louisiana. The Trump administration seeks to deport him, and they're using a rarely used statute in the Immigration and Nationality Act that supposedly allows the Secretary of State, currently Marco Rubio, to deport non-citizens whose presence has, quote, serious adverse foreign policy consequences. No criminal charges have been filed against Khalil so far, nor has any evidence of criminality been presented. Khalil was a key figure in Colombia's protests against Israel's war in Gaza, acting as a negotiator on behalf of the protesters to the administration. The administration alleges that Khalil supports Hamas, which the U.S. has designated a terrorist group. But the only evidence they've presented of this is a flyer from Hamas's media office that says "Our Narrative" that was found at a protest that he also happened to be at. There was no evidence provided that it had any links to Khalil himself, nor is there any evidence that Khalil organized the protest, led the protest, anything like that. In fact, he's denied doing those things, just that he was a spokesman for the general cause at Columbia as a Palestinian student, and that he negotiated presenting the student protesters' demands to the administration. A federal judge has thus far blocked the deportation pending a ongoing legal challenge. And the next update should become in a hearing set for March 27th. There's been protests all around the country, but especially in New York, supporting Khalil. So with that, we are very lucky to have our guest today, Jenin, a civil liberties lawyer and good friend of ours, specializing in First Amendment law. Jenin's best known for her work on the Murphy versus Missouri case, which made it to the Supreme Court and challenged the Biden administration's pressure on social media companies to suppress conservative speech and alleged COVID-related misinformation. So, Jenin, oh, and anybody else watching, we are live right now. So if you have questions for Jenin, put those in the chat and we will get to those later in the show. But I'm going to ask the first question. Jenin, so Khalil's a green card holder, a legal permanent resident. And given the lack of criminal allegations, just the fact that, he was a student protester there speaking, peaceful protester, according to all the available evidence. This to me seems clearly in violation of his First Amendment rights, but a big outstanding question here is what constitutional rights does a green card holder even actually have?
So it's a complicated question. And I would say this is sort of a clash between this immigration provision, which gives the Secretary of State kind of unfettered access to remove anyone from the country based on his representation or his belief that they pose a national security risk without defining what that means. And First Amendment law, particularly. In terms of sort of the general question of whether green card holders have constitutional rights, our courts generally recognize that they do. The question is whether those rights are superseded by this immigration provision, which allows the Secretary of State to basically make a unilateral determination and remove someone from the country. Now, as someone who likes to sort of start from an originalist interpretation of the Constitution, I would say it's pretty clear that he cannot be removed on these grounds. So the First Amendment states Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. That applies to the executive branch too. It's kind of complicated, but basically the framers didn't envision the executive branch effectively making law, which they kind of do now. So the courts are very clear that that applies to executive actions as well. So to the extent that it's clear when that text is a restraint on government, right? It doesn't talk about the immigration status of the speaker. So it's clear to me that just based on an originalist textual interpretation, that obviously trumps any kind of statute. I mean, the Constitution trumps statutes. If the statute and the Constitution are in conflict, the statute has to fall. So I would say it's pretty obvious it's unconstitutional. The question has not actually reached the Supreme Court. To my knowledge, there's one decision. It's very rarely invoked. So there was one district court, that's the lowest level of the federal courts. One district court decision that declared the provision was unconstitutionally vague because a person couldn't be on notice as to what it meant, which we're actually seeing here. Khalil was only engaged in pro-Palestine activity. There was no way he could have known that he would be deported away from his wife and soon-to-be child based on this provision. So, and by coincidence, the judge who actually said that was unconstitutionally vague was Judge Barry, who's Trump's sister in the district court in New Jersey, and she declared that in 1996. But a district court decision in New Jersey is not going to be binding precedent on another judge, although the case has been moved to New Jersey, so it's a little bit complicated. Yeah. But in any event, I expect the question will reach the Supreme Court. So,
okay, yeah, that's fascinating. Do you want to keep going, or should I ask the next question? So, okay, we have lots of questions here because what I'm seeing is people suddenly start like reassessing the entire First Amendment and whether that's applicable, whether it's even good, and kind of presenting these like national security grounds. But we're just rushing past the most basic things here, which one of them is, what is the evidence? Like, has there been any evidence presented? And so I think
and what evidence is needed? I mean, to deport somebody for anything, right, like constitutional violation or not.
So for the most part, people can only be convicted based on, well, there are a few things that can be deported for, but if it's in the criminal context, usually you have to be convicted, not just charged. I was a public defender for 9 years, and I worked with immigration attorneys when my clients were being deported for their crimes.
Mm.
And so I became a little bit familiar with how that works. Charges are not enough. It's just that there's this provision, this special provision that's very rarely invoked.
Hmm.
And it basically says that it doesn't define what a national security threat is. And it basically says that the Secretary of State can make this decision unilaterally. So it really is, in my opinion, this statute clearly just conflicts with the Constitution, which gives people due process rights and gives those rights to non-citizens, and doesn't just allow people to be deported on the whim of the president. Some people disagree with me, constitutional experts, and say, no, that's really important. The president has all authority in the realm of national security. It's extremely important that he be able to carry this out without having to show anything. I don't agree with that interpretation.
I mean, a national security, the line they're using in their, to me and to you, clearly unconstitutional justification, this, Secretary of State can remove anybody for that he determines to be, a foreign policy concern. How would this idea that it's for national security, like, in what way are any of these people determining that Khalil is a national security concern? They've provided absolutely nothing for that. They're only claiming that he has verbally supported Hamas, something nobody has found and dug up ever. The best that they have is this flyer, like, that was just at a protest he was also at. So that is kind of then a bridge to this question of that there's other provisions in that statute that somebody could be deported over. I've seen many people claim, because he supports terror, allegedly, again, no evidence, that is the grounds for deportation. Now, where is the bar on what does it mean to support terror according to the law? And what bar, if they could provide evidence, if they could find evidence, would they need to pass to deport him on those grounds?
Well, okay, it's a little complicated because, first of all, the administration is not claiming he supported terrorism. They're just saying his position on Palestine. I mean, they've basically admitted it's his position on Palestine conflicts with their foreign policy and fighting anti-Semitism across the globe, because apparently fighting for Palestinian human rights is anti-Semitic, which we all know is crazy. But that's the justification. And so in their determination, that poses a national security threat, and so they can deport him. And I mean, you don't understand. Don't underestimate how much I hate this statute, but I think the statute is the problem, because the statute basically says it's up to the president, or sorry, the Secretary of State. If he says someone's a national security threat for any reason, if he says you're a national security threat because of the kind of peanut butter you like to eat, I don't know, he can decide that and take you out of the country. And I think that the statute actually basically does allow that. So what I think the better arguments are going to be is that the statute falls because it's not consistent with the Constitution on both due process and First Amendment grounds. I personally don't think I think you can argue that the statute is unconstitutionally vague for the reason that you said, like, we don't know what national security means. If supporting Palestinian human rights is considered a threat to national security, that's so vague, nobody could possibly expect that interpretation. So you could also call it, that's also overbreadth doctrine, which says like it's sweeping up a lot of protected speech. So if they changed the statute to define national security threat, and they said, I mean, look, I could envision a situation where someone didn't convict a crime, but there was like a lot of evidence that they were embedded with a terrorist organization. And, you might want the administration to be able to remove them without going through, without having to get a conviction. I still think, generally speaking, you would be able to use material support for terrorism laws and stuff like that if they were doing something really wrong. But let's say there might be some scenario like that. Then the statute needs to define that. And it needs to be much more specific. It needs to be much more clear. And it needs to not just be based on speech, because otherwise that conflicts with the First Amendment.
So is there any definition of what material support of terror even means? Or is it's just vague in the law? Material support is just a phrase. Nobody's ever really defined that, because, where would cross the line? Like, we can sort of think through a spectrum of actions somebody might take, right? There's if I understood you just right, what we're all clearly agreeing is way over the line, which is just he's spoken in favor of a terror group potentially once. Again, not evidence of that here, but just theoretically. That would be a free speech issue. You don't have that. So then a next step might be kind of taking some sort of action for that terror group. And there's a spectrum of that. So it could be, like in this case, potentially, let's say it was him, and we have no reason to believe it was him, that was personally handing out these Hamas flyers to people. That's our narrative of the October 7th, right? Then the level past that might be being involved, being actually coordinating with them, right? Like he's on the phone with them or chatting with them and is kind of taking advice from them or communicating to people here in the United States, actually in coordination with them. A next level past that might be sending money to them or getting money sent by people to them. Another level past that would, of course, be like a coordinating terror acts or some sort of actual strategic action that's beyond monetary. So given that kind of whole spectrum of what material support could be, where does the line start to get crossed in terms of can't deport versus can deport?
I mean, well, if you were convicted of material support of terrorism, that's not even just about deportation. You can be convicted of that as an American citizen, and there are people in prison for that who are U.S. citizens. I'm not an expert in those statutes, but I will say it's probably somewhere below giving money and somewhere beyond just having phone conversations. I do know that there are people who are in prison in the United States for. I think they actually get money to Hamas. I'm not sure. It could have been Hezbollah. They gave money for like children's relief programs that, because these are sort of quasi-governmental entities who do things like provide relief for children who need medical care and stuff like that. They had given money specifically for that purpose, but the court found that the government charged them under these laws, and the court found that because money is fungible, they were effectively giving support to a terrorist group, and therefore they could be found guilty under these statutes. So you can't like earmark the money and say, I'm giving it to Hamas to help the children, but not to kill civilians. That doesn't work. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly what the line is. I suspect if you were chatting with Hamas members on the phone and sort of coordinating with them, even if it was non-terroristic activities, I'm guessing you probably could be convicted. But I'm not an expert in that specific area of statutory authority.
So something else I've heard along these lines is that none of this really matters, right? Okay, let's say that this statute is unconstitutional, that ultimately there's other reasons why anyone can kind of be deported at any time. I've heard this from Sargar and Jetty of Breaking Points, which I think does wonderful coverage of this war and the U.S. stance on this war. But I disagree with him about this. I've seen him argue. Ultimately, they're a guest in this country, and okay, let's say this reason for deportation goes away. Well, they can just kind of keep coming up with other reasons because ultimately, people don't have a right to be in the United States unless they're a citizen. What do you make of that?
No, that's just not true. I mean, green card holders have due process rights. That's very clear. That's why there's this exceptional circumstance that's encapsulated by this provision that, has only been used a few times in our history. But the idea that you don't have a right to be in this country, green card holders are seen as on the path to citizenship. You're investing in a life. Like he has a pregnant wife here who's about to give birth. So I think from a humanitarian common sense perspective, we have to recognize that people who are green card holders do have a right to be in this country to some extent. And also to people who are so quick to say, oh, he has no constitutional rights, it doesn't matter. That sort of conflicts with the purpose of the First Amendment and the understanding the framers had when they included it in the Bill of Rights, which is that we are all better off when we hear different perspectives instead of silencing them. And I think Khalil is a perfect example. He grew up in a refugee camp in Syria because his family had been driven out of Palestine. He's exactly the kind of person Americans should be hearing from to understand why this conflict is going on, why a lot of people oppose our involvement in it or our support for Israel in it. And those are all the reasons that the framers understood that the First Amendment free speech clause should be included in the Bill of Rights. And they also wrote a lot about how free speech it's not just a right that we're given, by the Constitution. It's a fundamental, natural human right. If you believe in God, it's a God-given right. If you're not, it's just sort of in our nature. Like, nobody should be able to tell us that we can't air our opinions, that we can't share our views and our experiences with society. And so I think this is just wrong, and people are just being opportunistic and trying to use this to their advantage to get someone whose views they don't like out of the country while seeming consistent on free speech. But I think they're obviously being hypocritical.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. And I'd like to emphasize one of the criticisms I've seen of this case is people try to recast it as not a free speech issue at all. That's something I've seen from multiple people who say, actually, this has nothing to do with free speech. This is immigration law. This is about national security. This is not a free speech issue. And thus, we can simply execute that obscure immigration clause, and that should trump the First Amendment. Those are arguments that I've actually seen from prominent people who were in the anti-woke movement advocating for free speech for years. So I think we're really in this moment of being tested in our commitment to free speech as a principle, which is something that we believe in as a good for our culture and our society, not simply as a weapon that we use, like you said, opportunistically when it benefits us, and then revoke it when it's not in favor of pushing our viewpoints. So I think I'd love to lay to rest the idea that this case has nothing to do with free speech. I think on the contrary, it has everything to do with free speech. Right. And thus discussing it in this way helps us better understand, why does free speech matter? What is our commitment to free speech? What are the threats to free speech? Because we've seen like a lot of this kind of nitpicking here, where it's like, oh, but in this particular case, we can just totally throw that out because of this particular detail. So we want to talk about like the Columbia University apartheid divestment movement aspect of this. So I don't know if that's something that you want to address, because that's a point that you had brought up.
I have that question. So, all right. So we've sort of handled here the ties to terror part and speech versus actually being a Hamas representative that's a foreign policy threat. No evidence to that. We're on First Amendment grounds here. Now, the other line of arguing that I'm seeing about why he should be deported is, oh, these protests, they held a building and trespassed in there and held janitors hostage or something. I haven't looked too much into the details of that claim, but there were some riots. I've seen some footage of people like trying to force their way into a door, like holding a ladder. And this was a huge problem for the university. And Khalil is the spokesman for the protest movement. He denies being a spokesman or a leader of or an organizer for Columbia University Apartheid Divest, which seems, to my understanding, to specifically be behind some of the more like what the radical protesters are doing. But Khalil is clearly speaking to those people. I mean, there's pictures of them together. There's a picture people have tried to present to me as evidence that Khalil was participating in an illegal protest because there's these masked people that are sitting down, occupying the building, and he's just kind of standing there talking to them. So, that to me doesn't, like, being at a protest doesn't, to me, seem to be evidence of illegally occupying a building. But where's the line of his involvement with these protesters and some of the more extreme protesters and representing their position to the university in conversations, kind of serving as a go-between? in what way does that implicate him with potential crimes of the protesters? And could that be grounds for deportation?
Short answer, no. So, I mean, for the most part, our criminal law system and most civilized countries' criminal law system is predicated on the notion that you can't be held responsible for the actions of others. You are responsible for your own actions. Of course, there are some exceptions for like accomplice liability. And these are actually pretty controversial in criminal law. So, say you go plan to commit a robbery. Salome and Jake plan to commit a robbery. They don't. I'm just using them as examples because they're right there. And they are like, Salome is totally on board with the robbery, but she's absolutely okay. We need guns, obviously, but like nobody can get hurt. And Jake gets freaked out and shoots the, person they're robbing. Salome can actually be held responsible for murder. But it's a very controversial theory among criminal law philosophers. So the idea behind it is basically like, well, if you plan to do something really bad and something really, really bad happens, well, you're kind of responsible for it. Others say, no, you can only be responsible for what you intend to do and the sort of foreseeable consequences of your actions. The other guys would say that's a foreseeable consequence of your actions. You tried to go hold up a jewelry store with guns. It was foreseeable somebody would get shot. So anyway, very hot topic. But certainly if you organize or participate in a protest, and you're not responsible for what other people might do at that protest. You're talking about thousands of people. If it's foreseeable that people would act poorly at a protest or commit minor crimes like trespass or graffiti or whatever, vandalizing property, it's foreseeable at all protests. So therefore, all protests should be illegal. So it doesn't make any sense. And in any event, most states, I mean, what makes you deportable? It's very, very complicated because most crimes are state law crimes and immigration law is federal. So you're like matching up state law crimes to federal law. And so it's a little bit complicated. So the states all have their own systems, but typically something like trespass would not get you deported. It has to be something a bit more serious than that. Usually it's called an aggravated felony or a crime of moral turpitude. So it's usually, at least an assault. Not a trespass. So all of this is just it's very strange. It's to me based on this like collective guilt mentality that all of these protesters are like share an intent and a mind, and they're all guilty for what the other one does, and they're all anti-Semitic, which is just ridiculous and antithetical to our entire like criminal justice system and classical liberalism.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And that collective guilt has been something that has really stood out to me as I see people. You wrote this tweet that was like, if anybody has any evidence of Khalil actually doing something that would constitute as supporting Hamas and like this kind of material support for terrorism that we're talking about.
I asked for evidence of all the claims. They're saying he led and organized these protests. Provide evidence of that. They're saying he's anti-Semitic or spreading anti-Semitism.
Right.
Provide evidence of that. That he's aligned with Hamas. Provide evidence of that. None. Just kind of nothing. A few very weak attempts, but mostly people not even trying.
What they'll do is exactly what you're describing. They'll send a video that he is not in of the protests where other people are doing something like setting up a tent or like being rowdy or being aggressive, and he's not in the video. He's like not there. But they're ascribing the actions of others to him as if he is somehow culpable for the actions of all protesters at that school. And I mean, it really kind of shows, like you said, this intent to ascribe collective guilt to a group that is really taking it's a nuanced issue. Obviously, there's like a whole spectrum of people that have different reasons for why they might criticize Israel or protest what they perceive as like a terrible crime going on in the world. And there's all the different people there, right? We've had this attempt to make it seem like it's anti-Semitic when there are Jews participating in these protests.
Many.
And speaking out on behalf of him now that he's been detained. So, I mean, you have this intent to kind of like flatten the entire thing and make it, of course, into this very tribal dynamic by which it's us versus them, the bad people versus the good people, which of course plays in beautifully to the attempt to say, people who have this viewpoint are a national security threat, and thus to protect us, we have to get rid of them. And so it really goes into like these problems that we've seen come up throughout history again and again in terms of like the Red Scare and fears over immigration and like people who are different. And it's just kind of like this replaying cycle. And it's really interesting to see it play out in this particular instance. But yeah, it is this kind of like collective guilt instance. So if you want to talk more about that tweet that you wrote and like the social contagion element of what's going on here, because listen, like I can't even go on Twitter anymore because
it's so depressing.
Oh my gosh. It's the worst.
Yeah.
It's the worst it's ever been in my life. And I like so actively try to like furiously like pictures of doggies and kitties and flowers and art and just like anything that's not all this depressing news. But then I'll engage with one news item and it's like, boom, that's my entire feed.
Yeah.
And what I notice is just like there really isn't a lot of good faith discussion around this issue in particular now. And it just seems like there's really this strange collective hysteria energy. And I do social media work for different companies, and one of them is affiliated with academia. And one of the things that's really interesting that I've seen is just like the attempt for people to bring everything back to Hamas. So if you're talking about like an issue with there was recently like the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, had I think you know about this maybe. I think you maybe tweeted about it. She called on Cooney to like take down a job listing for a Palestinian studies professor, and then has tried to create a task force that will look into whether quote unquote anti-Semitic theories are being taught. And a lot of this like really starts to get into the territory of infringing on academic freedom, like the freedom of universities to hire their own people to teach ideas and to not be watched by Big Brother and have what they teach and who they hire controlled by the government. And so nonetheless, like there's all this nuance in that issue, and none of it has to do with Hamas. And yet like I'll see the commentary online around this issue as this organization tries to like very in a nuanced way describe like, okay, well, here are the problems with this and here's how we could solve this in a rational and nuanced way that is balanced. And people just come back and they're like, we can't have Hamas in our universities. Like, what are you even talking about? Like, this has nothing to do with Hamas. Like, we're so many degrees removed. But it's just like this energy that seems to me to hearken to one, the Red Scare. Like it has that kind of sense of like there are enemies amongst us and we must suspend our normal rights and protocols to get rid of this threat from within. And two, also the kind of like hysteria after 9/11 that was like these people hate us for our freedom and we must do everything possible to fight back.
We don't have any freedom anymore, so
right, as it so often goes, right? It's like let's turn ourselves into an authoritarian country to protect our freedoms. Like we're going down that path, and there's just this strange moment. And I think that like the fact that the law that's getting invoked for supposedly trumping the First Amendment, as some people would like to have happened, this obscure immigration clause, a lot of like, whatever, I'm not an expert on this, but like I've been doing some research so I could talk about this and know some things. And it's just like so much that has to do with these kind of laws, like this one in particular, goes back to literally that Red Scare era where they were creating these kind of laws specifically so that they could go around and try to find out like who's supporting communists, who has ties to communist countries. And like they would just totally go over our normal rights to be able to do this. So, I mean, I wonder what you have seen from your side and how like that kind of legal history plays into what seems like a social contagion to a certain degree, not just like a debate over law.
Yeah, well, a lot of the really bad case law, or somewhat bad case law, I'm not going to be too pessimistic, comes from the communist era. So there were a few cases from the 50s where the Supreme Court said that people could be deported even though they had only belonged to the Communist Party in the past.
Right.
I think those cases are somewhat distinguishable because the court thought they deemed sort of membership in the Communist Party not even speech, and they considered the Communist Party like really a threat to the government, like that there were,
Mhm.
plots to overthrow the government and stuff. So it's a little different, and even US citizens could be punished for membership in the Communist Party. I still don't like those cases, and they say some things that aren't great. But there was another case from a little bit earlier, actually. I think it was the late 40s, called Bridges, which is actually very good. That was before these statutes were enacted that allowed people to be deported for having belonged to the Communist Party. And in that case, the court, it was an Australian guy who was being deported for membership for communist speech. I think he didn't
Mm.
belong to the party. And the Supreme Court there said a lot of good things that I think will be very useful to Mr. Khalil about how even green card holders have First Amendment rights, how it's a natural right, and they halted his deportation. So that will be very useful. But I think it is, very reminiscent of that era. The cases are very similar. And there's frankly, I'm sort of surprised because a lot of the people who are egging this on are people that I knew during COVID, and who really rebelled against the COVID restrictions and the free speech violations that occurred at that
Mm.
time, and are now, making all the arguments that you guys have cited. And
Right.
ironically, I keep trying to remind them, do you guys remember the protests where the New York Times was writing that the anti-lockdown people are affiliated with white supremacists and
Yep.
Nazis, and these protests were dangerous, and the trucker protests?
Yep.
It's it's really something. And like I have a friend who was here. You guys actually know him, Adam,
Oh
Adam
yeah.
Crichton, who is here on
He is
of
great.
these an H-1B visa from Australia. He was working for the Australian, and he was really anti-lockdown, and he would write, sort of anti the mandate stuff. The Biden administration could easily have invoked the
Mhm.
same policy against him and said he posed a national security risk because he was trying to tell people they shouldn't have to stay home and wear
Right.
masks and they shouldn't comply with the government. I don't think anybody I knew then who opposed the lockdowns and the COVID restrictions would have agreed with that. They would have been all up in arms about how this was a horrendous civil liberties violation. So it's sheer hypocrisy, and it's hard to watch.
I completely agree. And I think that's a great point to speak more to the precedent that this sets, because, like you said, we already went through a situation where this similar kind of thought and legal action was used against citizens, not green
Yeah.
card holders even, but citizens actually. Like, and you were centrally involved in one of those cases, which was the Biden administration trying to pressure social media companies to censor citizens' speech for the
Yeah.
sake of reducing harm and all of that. And we've seen instances where the government has referred to citizens as potential domestic terrorists, and the incidents of
Yeah.
related to like the PTA meetings that parents would go to, and that
Mhm.
whole incident. And so the first thing that came to my mind when I saw this case was, let me figure out what's actually going on here, which is something that people don't often
Yeah.
do before
No.
immediately reacting. And
Yeah.
then the second thing that came to mind was, this could set a really bad precedent, because I could see how so easily that language around being a threat to national security, being anti American, and being a kind of terrorist could be turned around on the very people who are now defending that kind of language when it's
Yeah.
convenient for them. So I wonder if if you have anything to say in terms of like, what kind of precedent could this set if it actually goes through? And maybe it would help people think through, like, this is a kind of like, in my mind, one of the important things about law is that it's never just about the singular case. It's about how it will affect the country and people down the line, and how this will be interpreted from then on. So I wonder if you have anything that you can help us think through that issue with.
Sure. So I'll actually use the past example and then go forward. I just wrote an
Right.
article on this exact issue that was published in Compact this morning, Compact magazine. So in the case I represented, people who'd been censored on social media, Murphy versus Missouri, as it was known in the Supreme Court. It was Twitter users, including two scientists, one of whom is about to be confirmed as the director of the NIH, Jay
Yes.
Bhattacharya, also
Amazing.
Martin Kulldorff.
Great.
Um, who's an epidemiologist or was an epidemiologist at
Right.
Harvard. And the Supreme Court ultimately found basically that they couldn't show they had standing, which means they couldn't trace their harm, or they couldn't show that the government caused their harm. Because what we were basing our First Amendment argument on was sort of a third party theory, that the government was coercing the third parties, the social media companies, to censor our clients' speech. And there's a robust body of case law that basically says the government cannot use third parties to do what it can't directly. And this makes a lot of sense. I mean, in fact, there would be no point to the Constitution if that wasn't true. Like, think, the Fourth Amendment is an obvious example where the Fourth Amendment prohibits the government from searching your home without a warrant and probable cause. Well, imagine if the government could just hire a private company to go break into your home and search it without a warrant. There'd be no point to the Fourth Amendment. They just pay other companies to do that. So we were sort of arguing that the same thing applies in the context of the First Amendment, making this analogy. But the Supreme Court said, well, you can't show that your clients were censored because of the social media companies. It might have been the company's own policies. You can't tie it directly. And a lot of liberals were very excited, and they were like, yay, we won, even though the court never reached the actual merits. And I was like, no, this is really bad, because this is really going to bar a lot of plaintiffs from the courthouse door. Now, I see that exact circumstance where people want to bring First Amendment claims against the Trump administration, students especially, who are being punished on campus, and saying they're being punished because the administration has pressured the campuses or the universities to punish them. So it's the same sort of third party. It's very analogous. It's the same sort of third party theory, that you're being directly punished by this third party, but it's at the behest of the government, and the government can't use the third party to take away your rights. But they're going to run into the Murphy doctrine now. So the liberals, who were very happy about this, are now going to realize it's going to prevent some of the claims, at least. It's certainly going to throw up a roadblock to students and professors who want to bring these types of claims. So when you look into the future, not only is that doctrine going to be an obstacle, but for instance, if the Khalil case comes out badly, and other cases, say people who are here on visas, maybe said more controversial things, who I think might be harder for courts to end up agreeing with the plaintiffs, that's going to really chip away at immigrants' First Amendment rights. It's going to chill speech. People who are here on green cards and visas are going to be very nervous about speaking their minds. That's really bad for the country. I want to hear from immigrants. I want to hear from people from other countries who have unique perspectives, who can share their experiences with us, and who can help us shape our foreign policy based on those experiences. And so, I think, and we should also remember, I think there's a chance that the Trump administration is going to start to go after U.S. citizens. In fact, it's said it's going to look at terrorism laws to see if they can use them to punish students. So if the Trump administration can use terrorism laws and succeeds with that in going after students for participating in protests, that could happen. There could be right-wing protests in 5 years under a Democrat administration, and the exact people who are chomping at the bit for that to happen, champing at the bit actually, could be punished. So this is exactly why we have a constitution, in order to protect us from when our party or our preferred policy positions are not represented by the government, because sometimes that's going to be the case. And that's exactly why we have a constitution, because, there's majority rule to an extent, but we also have individual rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. So it's very, very dangerous to chip away at them. And those who are happy about this should really think twice.
Yeah, I completely second what you're saying. And it's really shocking to me that people are not having the foresight on this issue to think one administration ahead, because there's no guarantee that the next administration is going to be one that's favorable to your views, and you will have empowered that opposing administration to punish your views by now using that power for your own benefit. So it's not a good look. Is there something you want to add?
I think we're coming sort of close to the end of the time. So I want to ask, what's going to happen next? And I have questions around that on a lot of different levels. As you said, the administration is going to go after citizens for, allegedly being Hamas or whatever. And so that's one key question right there, is this tying of anyone that is pro-Palestinian, anyone that is anti-war, and calling them, pro-Hamas, calling them terrorist supporters, all these kind of propaganda lines. Well, I guess I have two questions around that. One is the people saying that. How much do you think they actually believe it? But then, perhaps more importantly, how much do you think judges in this country are going to believe it when cases are brought before them and they're being told this person is pro-Hamas and a threat and a terrorist because they've participated in pro-Palestinian activism?
So as far as the people, I think there's a lot of disparate beliefs. I think some people are using it very cynically. They know exactly what they're doing. I would put certain people, I'm not going to say any names, but say certain people who might run the free press, I would say, are, using this very cynically. They know what they're doing. I think a lot of people have no idea what they're talking about. They really think Palestinians are just all terrorists. That's what they picture in their heads. They've been influenced by the media, movies, all of that in that way. As far as judges, that's a tricky one. I don't have faith in the federal judiciary as a whole. I've been in front of some extremely smart judges who would definitely prod the government and say, what do you mean? What does it mean to belong to Hamas? I've been in front of judges who I can imagine would not, and who would just accept that representation and say, okay, stamp, out. And I suspect that's why the government tried so hard to move him to Louisiana, because I know it's a little bit stereotyping, but you're going to find judges who are a little bit more willing to say, he's a Palestinian guy, pro-Palestine, same as being Hamas, out of the country, than you might in New Jersey or New York, where he's going to have his case heard in New Jersey. So I think that's anybody who does strategic or impact litigation. It's called judge shopping, and it's not an unfair name, but anyone who does that, you think very, very hard about the judge. It depends on the type of case. There are certain jurisdictions, like small towns or very small districts, where if you file in that district, you know which judge you're going to get. And there are certain, like, this judge loves my issue, I'm going to win if I file here. So I'll at least win in the district court and get some headlines and stuff like that. There isn't a strategic litigator in the country who doesn't think about that. That's part of the game, and it's probably one of the most important. Of course, like this issue is going to go to the Supreme Court, almost definitely, if not in Khalil's case, a similar case. So in the end, it's really about the Supreme Court. It is a national security court. So I would say Roberts, even Kagan, maybe. I'm not sure. Alito, maybe. Thomas, maybe. I'm nervous about them. Like the usual guys I would trust on the First Amendment are very national security-esque, and so they might make an exception in this context. So I'm nervous about the Supreme Court.
Wow, that's very concerning. I was hoping for better news there, because I was hoping you would say something along the lines of judges are smarter than propagandists and will actually seek more evidence. So that's quite concerning. I wanted to ask you also, so something I didn't know about this until today. Have you heard of this case? I don't know the formal case name, but about the LA8. Have you heard of this?
Maybe.
So in the 1980s, there were 7 Palestinians and a Kenyan targeted for deportation because of speech supporting the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Or they weren't deported, but they were tried to be deported. And it spent 20 years in court. And ultimately the state, I didn't get a clear answer on this today, but either dropped the case or lost. I mean, they were just berated by the judge. And so that's interesting precedent, but if the case was dropped, I guess it probably didn't set anything into stone. But it's interesting to me that took 20 years. And at the end of the 20 years, ultimately they were told, okay, well, you're back on a 3-year path to citizenship. So I've seen a lot of comments saying, by the time this is resolved, Khalil is going to be well out of this country. They have him in a deportation center right now. He is not a free man. What are the next steps for him? And how long could this be a 20-year, it's just going forever sort of thing? Or is this going to get resolved quickly, or get us from here to the end?
I don't know. I mean, he almost definitely won't sit in ICE detention for a long time. I suspect he'll either be released or he'll probably be released soon, even if the proceedings aren't dismissed against him. I can't predict what will happen. If I were the government, and I don't want to give them advice, but I suspect they're not listening to this, so that's probably okay. If I were the government, what I would do, so that, they didn't know that he had a green card, and I don't think they realized how sympathetic he was with the 8-month pregnant wife, and the fact he hasn't actually said anything even controversial to most people. So I think they just went along, possibly with Beitar. We don't have to get into them, but hate group, who wanted him deported. They maybe went along with the recommendations of someone who wasn't too bright. And I think they found themselves in a bind. So apparently his wife, when they came and said, we're taking your visa's been revoked. His wife was like, oh, he has a green card, and produced it. And they were like, that's been revoked. And they brought him in anyway. So if I were the government, I would let this case die down in the media and then silently drop the charges, or silently let him out, because they're very likely to create bad precedent with this case. And then I would start to go after people. I would be much more careful about who I went after. Like, again, I don't think they should do this. This is not what I would do. I'm a First Amendment absolutist, but I would find people who actually said, yay, October 7th or something. And we're on student visas, so really don't have the kind of ties to this country that make me particularly sympathetic. And I'd start to create good case law using that, because they are in a bind. But I suspect that they may realize they made a mistake, but at this point they don't want to let him go because it looks weak, because the case got so much publicity. So they might find a way to sort of let it die down, and then when people are paying less attention, and people will have forgotten about this case in 2 weeks. The news cycle is like that. Nobody remembers what happened. I just remembered Trump had a bullet graze his ear last night.
I know, it feels like a decade ago.
So I suspect that there's a chance that they'll drop the whole thing once things have died down, and once people are focused on something else or someone else.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you want to do some rapid fire guest questions? Okay, so real quick, does deportation court include a jury or just a judge?
Judge.
Okay. Let's see. What other? Oh, I'm there. Okay, we got another one. For deportation cases, when the judge or jury is coming to a guilty conviction, what standard of proof do they follow? A preponderance of the evidence or beyond a reasonable doubt?
It's not a guilty determination. It's totally different. So I'm not an immigration law expert. I actually don't remember, but I mean, if you're deporting someone because they have a criminal conviction, it's not. I mean, that's not hard to do. You either produce proof of the criminal conviction or not. So it's not like a determination of your guilt of a crime. The determination of the crime is made under state law usually, or federal criminal law. And then, you're being deported because, so it's an administrative proceeding. It's not a criminal law proceeding, or even a civil trial.
Okay, fascinating. All right, I think that's enough questions. I know that you have been busy today and you have had a long day, so we're not going to keep you much longer. Thank you so much for joining us. This is such an important issue, and it's so great to be able to ask an actual lawyer. Imagine that, asking someone that might actually know what they're talking about for such a complicated
I get lectured all the time by people who've never read a case on the law. So.
Overnight legal experts.
All right. Thanks, guys, for having me. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Thank you so much for being here, Jenin.
Okay, bye.
Anything else before we wrap up?
Oh, we got a lot. I'm not ready to wrap up. We're letting Jenin go, but we've got things to talk about, okay? Because now we have spoken to the legal What's going on with that over there, with that camera situation? We got a whole, I guess it's just going to be me, guys, because you just got cut out for no apparent reason. That's not fun. Anyway, so we've got a whole bunch of things that I would like to touch on briefly as we wrap up, because we've spoken to our expert that's kind of like set the groundwork for us to figure out, like, okay, what is actually real here? Because listen, can we just talk shit for a minute? All the people that are like, this is not a free speech case. What the hell is that? That makes me mad. That makes me mad. I think that's such a sign of like the level of bad faith reasoning that this issue has brought out of people, that people who were like previously free speech warriors, oh, we've got to have free speech for everybody. It's free speech is so important for the people you dislike. And it's like, yeah, because you were the people that people disliked and you wanted free speech at that time. And now it's time to defend it for people that you don't like, and suddenly it's like, this has nothing to do with free speech, actually. So a lot of bad faith takes going around on that. So you're hearing here from an actual free speech specializing lawyer on how much this is a free speech issue. And what's fascinating to me is just like all of the precedents. So as I was preparing to talk to her, I looked into the different instances in which terrorism and national security are brought up as reasons for the government to like far overstep the normal restrictions on it. And a lot of them, like Jenin said, harken back to a time where people were terrified that there was like going to be this communist uprising within their own country. And I'm not just talking about like, oh, there were communists and yeah, they were trying to get rid of like actual communist spies. That's not just what the Red Scare was. Like the idea was like, we are massively infiltrated like by communist sleeper cells. And one day they're just going to wake up and take over the whole country. So this is like legit a Red Scare. And a lot of these laws and this kind of rhetoric that we're hearing used in the case regarding Khalil is so similar to these kind of early Red Scare cases and just the fear over like being infiltrated from like a threat that is outside, and we must like protect our country, and so we need to become authoritarians to stay free. It's this kind of thing. And so it's fascinating to see that. So I want to like go see if I can bring some of these up for people, because you can look at them more yourself. But one of them, like we discussed, well, I don't have any of the notes here. That's unfortunate. Whatever, I'll just talk about it from memory. So one of the ones was like this law that was brought up by like one of the first people that was trying to create this kind of national security apparatus. Palmer is the last name. And basically what the government did in this instance was like straight up just round up thousands of people without a warrant, without evidence of having done anything. Oftentimes people sat in detention for months without charges, and they ended up letting like tons of the people that they had apprehended go free because there was all this public outcry, and also because they didn't have any evidence that these people actually did anything. And the really interesting thing was that this was like during I think this was like the 20s that this happened, but it could have been the 40s. I can't remember. There's two times where this happened. And the interesting thing was that like part of what was driving this fear was, yes, the fear of like communist ideology, but also the people that were targeted were immigrants. It was particularly like Italian immigrants that people were like, they're bringing in their ways from outside and we have to be skeptical. And it's like, now it seems so silly to be suspicious of Italian Americans, right? But that's actually how these patterns just replicate. As we change as a culture, the people that we get worried that are going to be different from our way of life and bring in their different ideas that will threaten our American ideals changes. But it's the same pattern of creating this like hysteria around an outside threat and then utilizing that hysteria to then erode our civil liberties. And the problem is that you think that you're addressing this threat, but actually you're creating a bigger problem down the line by eroding your freedoms in order to supposedly combat this threat. And it's really unfortunate to see this kind of play out again and again and again throughout history, because we don't seem to learn our lessons, do we? It's really like, I really kind of thought that we had gotten the free speech thing down. You know, I thought like a lot of the people that like Jenin spoke about, like during the COVID era where there was so much of this kind of like free speech antagonism around, oh, misinformation, or you're questioning the vaccine and things like this are going to cause harm. We played all of that out during the leftist time, the BLM thing, where it was like, oh, we're going to cancel people because of what they said 5 years ago on Twitter or something. We played that out. And nonetheless, here we are again, oftentimes with the same people who were great speakers on those issues, now telling us that, but in this case, we need to curtail free speech. And actually, it's not so important in this case. And it's, as always, not the case. We protect free speech when it's people having speech that we don't like, because that's actually how you protect free speech. You're standing off camera, nodding. You have something on your face.
I'm on camera in the wide shot, but
why is it like that? Why is it little like that?
I didn't know you were going to keep going after we left Jenin, so the show wasn't set up to do that.
You didn't think I was going to keep going?
Nope.
I always keep going. I can talk. I'm a professional yapper.
Mm-hmm.
What did you think? All right, let's see if we've got any more questions. If anybody wants to share their comments or their questions. The Chinese as well, Noah says, I looked into one of these laws. I wish I had all the notes in front of me. It's unfortunate that I don't, but it's very quick to look it up. There's only a few of these like major moments in American history where national security was invoked to like massively erode civil liberties under the guise of like, oh, these people are a threat. And one of these old laws that I think is partly being invoked in this case, or at least it sets like a lot of the precedent for the law that's being invoked in this case, or the policy rather, like quite literally had a racial quota set for how many people were allowed to enter the country via immigration. And it was like, we have 60,000 spots given to English people, and then like 101 were allocated for the Chinese. And so that has since been removed from that previous law. But it just goes to show that it's like the laws that are being invoked in this case are really not good. And the problem is like we're having this tension with the laws of the free speech and the national security type laws. And it's like, which world would you prefer to live in? The one where the national security laws are taking precedence, or the one where free speech, one of the most iconically American core liberal principles of this country, takes precedence? For me, it's an obvious answer. But I actually believe in free speech. So that's not something I would say for everybody. Let's see if we have any quick commentary. Oh, Cody said, also, how does one college student, problematic ideas or no, meet the threshold of being, quote, a threat to the foreign policy and national security interests of the United States? That is a great question, and it's a question we are all asking. And I think it's just fascinating to me because as much as I loved talking about the legal framework with Jenin, I think one of the things that's like particularly important to this is not just the law, but the psychology of how people are coming to decide what law is important. And you talked a little bit about this, like the social contagion aspect, which is really, really, really central to almost everything that happens now because of the way that social media allows for people to join these kind of like collective moments and sometimes collective panics. And I think that this is one of these instances where you have some low information individuals who can see someone that might say, hey, look, I'm sure Khalil is like a leftist, like more radical than I am. Like I probably disagree with him on almost everything, but he's not a terrorist threat. Like, I think that when we get to that point where we're conflating people we disagree with and whose views we really dislike, but who aren't actually doing violence, planning to do violence, supporting violence, we're in danger. And it's kind of funny to see the whole cycle play again, because I remember just a few years ago trying to tell the left who was doing this, and this is on them, right? Like a lot of the issues that we're dealing with, it's like, hey guys, remember when we tried to tell you why it was bad to say speech is violence? Well, here's why. Now it's your turn to be subjected to these bad ideas that are illiberal. And I don't want anybody to be subjected to them, but apparently we are on the merry-go-round from hell where everybody's relearning the same lessons again and again. And so, yeah, I mean, I think if you're taking a clear-eyed approach to what it really means to be a national security threat and a potential terrorist threat, you'd have to have a little more than he was at a protest where some people were destroying property or put up tents, and where some flyers that talk about language that Hamas has used or written were passed out. If that's the case, you end up in a real sketchy situation where your tweets become evidence of terrorism. If you happen to attend a rally that later went sour, well, you were there. Now you're culpable for that. I mean, it really just opens up this framework where we're applying these like serious terms that then invoke this kind of broad, unrestrained government power to take action, right? If I start calling people terrorists without having a very narrow definition of that, and terrorism is one of the things that this policy allows the government to act against unrestrained, well, then we've just empowered the government in an incredibly dangerous way. So these are the kind of things that we really, I think there's just something to thinking about politics and especially law, like we discussed, where you can't just think about what you want right now. You can't think about, I want this outcome right now. You have to think about all the different potential outcomes that could come about if you pursue this course of action. And I just do not see people doing that. I think it's really just like they're so either propagandized or just like angry, whatever it is, or lacking the information, that they're just not thinking through the repercussions of empowering the government to designate being at a protest where some flyers from a designated terrorist organization were passed out by who knows who. Now you're a terrorist because you happen to be in the same vicinity. It doesn't set a good precedent. And this is the thing, like, it doesn't actually make us safer, right? Because if there are actual terrorist threats, then prosecute them. If people have done actual crimes, prosecute them for the crimes. But this is trying to make speech a crime, and that doesn't make us safer. So, and I think especially, like, look, this is the black sheep. The whole point here is that oftentimes truth is found on the fringes. Oftentimes it's the people who have this uncomfortable truth or an idea that they want to share, but that the mainstream is not ready to hear yet because it upsets the status quo. It upsets what everybody has become used to. But that doesn't make it less true. And that doesn't make it less important for us to still allow that to be heard. And so it's just like one of the most central ideas to a society that enables individuals to live the life they want is that we provide the freedom for them to do that. And I will leave you there. Thank you all for joining the live stream. Thank you for the great questions and comments. I agree, Cody, we need to be able to distinguish between ideological threats and existential threats. That is something that we seem to be struggling with, but at least we are talking about it. So thank you all for supporting the Black Sheep. Thank you for subscribing so that we can have these conversations and have guests like Jenin on. Make sure that you go and follow Jenin, check out her work. She is great, and it's great to support people like her that are trying to have nuanced conversations around these really heated and often unnuanced topics. And so make sure you are subscribed to the Black Sheep so that you stay updated on our next live stream. And we leave you there. Have a good night.